So good afternoon, everybody. The title for today's presentation is Hudson Bay, the East Coast of the Prairies Trade Corridor. Um, my name is Mark Ferguson, and on behalf of my colleagues at the McMaster Institute for Transportation and Logistics, I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the MITL In Conversation Luncheon Series. First order of business is land acknowledgement. McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So, the In Conversation series, we've been doing it since the beginning of 2022, and things have been going quite well. Generated a fair amount of interest across a wide range of topics, had a lot of interesting discussions. As far as uh, how we'll approach things today. There'll be a presentation for the first half hour or 35 minutes or so from Dr. Barry Prentice. Afterwards, we'll handle things, the Q&A session through the chat function on Zoom, and I'll administer that and engage in discussion with Dr. Prentice. Um, The presentation will be recorded and can be accessed later on the MITL website, so that's something to look out for. One other quick note before I introduce Barry is that we have our speaker for December put in place, and that's going to be Dr. Kara Kokelman from the University of Texas. We haven't quite established the topic yet, but that'll be sorted out soon, and we'll be advertising what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting presentation in December. So, with regard to today, Dr. Prentice is a professor of supply chain management at the I.H. Asper School of Business, University of Manitoba. He's also an associate of the Transport Institute and was the third director from 1996 to 2005. His major research and teaching interests include logistics, transportation economics, urban transport, and trade policy. Dr. Prentice founded the Department of Supply Chain Management at the I.H. Asper School of Business. He was made an honorary life member of the Canadian Transportation Research Forum in 2009, and he has been a fellow in transportation at the Northern Policy Institute since 2015. So with that, I'll pass things over to Barry.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. The title I've chosen, Hudson's Bay, the East Coast of the Prairies Trade Corridor, is purposeful to try and give everybody maybe a little different vision of what we're talking about. Uh, the Hudson's Bay, we think of it as a northern cold, ice-covered area, but in fact, it's the prairies' access to the Atlantic Ocean. And so it is our East Coast, and many think of it as a North Coast, but it's actually our East Coast. So let me move from there to talk a little bit about uh, Churchill's trade corridor reputational deficit. Uh, what do people think about Churchill when they hear about it? Well, only seasonal navigation comes up, Arctic weather conditions, and of course, it's not true that it's cold. Obviously, it is cold, and although that's changing, uh, a somewhat wonky rail line had its troubles over time. And then finally, a lonely grain elevator that hasn't seen grain moving very much for some years now. So those are the kinds of ideas that people generally have. Well, I'd like to change your vision if I could. The first thing I'd like to point out is that locations don't change, but economic circumstances can. And as a result of that, maybe there's a time to look at this in very different eyes, and the economics have certainly changed, and I'll come through to that. Uh, I'd like to point out that this was the traditional trade route from 1670 to about 1900. This is the way most products came into the prairies. Of course, when the railways came in, they arrived at Winnipeg in 1879. They certainly became the dominant way of bringing products into the prairies, and eventually this trade route sort of disappeared, but it didn't disappear from the minds of the people who lived here. In fact, there was a very large uh, push politically by the farm communities to develop a rail line so they could ship grain out through our East Coast, as it were. And one of their slogans was the old way in is the best way out. And I'd like to look at the circumstances of a trade corridor and relate to why this still makes some sense for us to be looking today. So, to just start off with sort of the theory of trade corridors, it's composed of cities, gateways, and hubs that form the path. And of course, you have to have a way of getting to the corridor, and the gateway would be Churchill. Uh, this is a famous trade corridor. In fact, maybe the most famous of all time was the Silk Road, and it ran for almost well over a millennia, 200 BC to sometime in the mid 14th century, and it had its peak years from about 200 BC to 800 AD. Uh, we know about it. We don't really know that much about it because it's sort of lost in history. But the top map, which is a tourist map, shows a single line and it shows rich places along the route, which is true. Uh, Places on corridors tend to get rich because they benefit from the trade. But the one down below shows a more accurate picture. There was many competing routes leading to this area at that time. And of course, goods move both ways. Sugar and spices and so on that coming out of China were a major product, as well as silk and carpets. And we sent goods the other way too, furs and precious metals and even iron went on that trade corridor back towards China. So two-way trade was what we saw. Of course, they had economies of size. There were camel herds of up to, or caravans, I guess they called them, of up to 1,000 camels. And they had technology as well. There was the one hump camel and the two hump. We have a single stack and a double stack containers. So, our trade corridors have also changed. But as well as worth looking at this history, because there were periods where the environment interfered. The little ice age that came along and it actually stopped this trade corridor for quite a while because uh, the oases dried up, and so they couldn't bring the camels across. And there was also three periods of which there were pandemics that moved along this. So many things moved in these corridors in addition to just goods, ideas, religion, inventions. Many things moved on these corridors. Uh, of course, they also had difficult times when they didn't have security. And as long as the Romans were able to maintain their end and the Chinese could maintain their end, the trade flourished. When those two empires went into decline, trade was interrupted, and the other route, which would have been sensible, would go by water, wasn't possible because of the lack of security. This chap on the right and his friends and the pirates who apparently they're still there in some form or another, uh, blocked that trade, which forced the effort to find a route around, which is where technology came in, and we found a new route by water. So, what were the lessons from the Silk Road? Well, one was that changing trade policies will affect what goes on, and certainly the Chinese and the Europeans were blue hot and cold on this corridor over time, especially during the pandemics. Competing corridors were there. There wasn't just one route; there were many. Climate change interrupted, and it had an effect, positive or negative, on this trade corridor. Security, as I mentioned, and health were important issues. And finally, changes in transport technology, which caused the Silk Road to eventually be abandoned in favor of the ocean route. Today, by the way, just so everybody's clear, the Silk Road's kind of coming back in the form of a rail link between China and Europe for containers. So these routes don't go away, just technology and economics change. So where are we today? Well, if we look at trade routes around the globe, what we see is that the major trade routes are well established. There are choke points like Panama and Suez and the Straits of Malacca. And you don't see anything coming out of Churchill. It's not even appearing on this map as a trade route. We'd like to see that change. Uh, One of the reasons, of course, is that it has been very cold and iced up. This is a series of pictures. The top uh, line is for June and the bottom line is for December. And this is a 30-year period. So this shows the ice coverage 30 years ago or a little more. And what you can see is that the ice extended even in June quite a ways down the coast of Labrador, and there wasn't too much open water at that time. As we move forward, you can see the water is getting greater and the ice is retreating back. And in fact, now in June, there's even open water you can see in the Hudson Strait, which is one of those bottlenecks. In December, of course, it was completely covered with ice in 1993, and the ice extended almost to Newfoundland. This has retreated back further and further. And of course, that key area within the Hudson Strait is one of those places that is most blocked, and it's opening up. Moving forward to January 12th of 2025, we see open water on the uh, east coast of the Hudson's Bay, and of course, pretty much open water up to the Hudson Strait, and in here, the ice is thin. So over time, what we're seeing is an extension of the season. We're not using the full extent of the season yet for insurance reasons and other issues, but that could certainly change, and that's part of the plan, I suppose, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, what else has changed? Well, one of the big things is that the population has changed. When Churchill was opened, it was in 1931. The census just before that was 1.8 million people living in the prairies. Every 50 years, this has doubled, and now we have roughly 7.8 million people living in the prairies. So a much greater market than was there when this opened, and I expect to see growth continuing maybe at the same pace. So land settlement and population determines the demand for transport, and there's a lot more demand by the population living here today than there was when Churchill opened. There's also a lot more commodities to move. When Churchill opened, the only thing that really was moved was wheat. And that was, of course, the principal reason why it was established, and the one terminal was built to move it. Today, there's many more potential products that can move through Churchill. Certainly, potash, grain, lumber, minerals, petroleum products, as well as sulfur, and the one manufactured area, containers. Containers would be interesting because this is the one product that would move in both directions. Most of these other products are exported from Canada to world markets. Uh, this is an example of how the products could move and maybe why. If we look at the movement of potash to Brazil from Saskatchewan, at the current time, it's taken west over the Rocky Mountains, down the coast of North America, through the Panama Canal, around South America, and finally to Brazil. Well, most of South America lies east of North America. So by the time you get through a downhill run to Churchill on the rail and load up you're coming out of Churchill, you're almost straight south going to Brazil. So a much shorter route, and it, in theory, should be much less expensive. It's also an interesting one in terms of the volumes necessary. I did some calculations a while ago, just based on the averages from the Railway Association of Canada, as to what is the amount of cargo you need on a rail line to maintain the operations. And for the length of the Hudson's Bay Railway, it turned out you needed about 2 million tons a year of traffic. Well, this railway has seldom seen more than 500,000 tons a year. But in the case of potash, we're already shipping out 20 million tons of potash. So even if 10% of the potash went through Churchill, that commodity alone would be enough to sustain the rail line. Moving on, containers are one of my favorite topic areas for Churchill, simply because it's lighter weight, and that would be easier to move on the existing rail infrastructure than heavy rail cars, and it also gives two-way traffic. And this is a picture of what we're looking at today. Most of the containers are coming in through the St. Lawrence. They're from Europe or I guess, yeah, Middle East, coming through to um, the Prairies. They would come into Montreal and then they'd be taken by rail all the way to the Prairies. A fairly long route. This Montreal to Winnipeg alone would be about 2,000 kilometers. Uh, the other issue is that the ships coming into Montreal are constrained by the depth of the river. Uh, Generally speaking, about 3,500 TEUs is the size of the container ships. Well, you could bring in container ships much larger into a deep water port, such as Churchill, and the rail run would be much less as well. So, in terms of the total cost, given the larger ships and a shorter distance, we could shave quite a bit off the cost of moving containers in and out of Western Canada to Europe and markets on the Atlantic. Terminal investments required, obviously. If you're going to have a container port, you need container cranes. Potash needs a terminal, and LNG and sulfur. Every one of these commodities has to have its own unique terminal. So obviously, that's a major issue in terms of developing Churchill. And by and large, all of these are private sector investments. They're not government investments. So the government, its role is to create the infrastructure to allow the terminals to be built and to function. Uh, there's also this question of rail investment. A lot of investment has going into the railway in the past few years, and we'll come back to that. But the problem area has always been this link from Gillam to Churchill. Of course, the initial rail line was supposed to go to Port Nelson, which would be able to go over soils that weren't affected by permafrost. This was abandoned because the port had problems with silting in, although there is interest today in perhaps reviving this and having a new port located there as an export port. Uh, this could be improved, although there is a question mark as we are seeing the ice gradually disappear on Hudson's Bay, and the prediction is that by the end of the century there'll be no ice on Hudson's Bay. We can't imagine that this area, which is a frozen peat bog, will be able to support the railway. Maybe it can. Maybe there's ways of doing it. The other alternative, though, would be to build a new line further west of the existing line over the rocks, where you'd have a solid rail base and you wouldn't have these problems. Another alternative which has come to my attention is that there is a rail line up to Puckatawagan, and there was a rail line, the base is still there, to Lynn Lake. Pushing the railway across the north could be another option and give a second route, and certainly would open up a lot of this territory for mineral development and other issues. So many possibilities exist for the railway. In terms of moving forward, this is a picture of the Hudson's Bay from the report, and we do have a video which I'd like to now ask Mark to play, and I'll just stop at this point.
Just bear with me for a second here.
Arctic Gateway Group shares a vision for a thriving Arctic trade corridor. A vision that has Indigenous economic reconciliation at its core. We're proving to the world that we can move the vast resources of Western Canada by rail to Hudson Bay and that we can export these resources to the world from the Port of Churchill. We've been able to replace hundreds of railway ties, rebuilt multiple bridges, improved the reliability of our operations, and cut rail travel time by 2.5 hours.
We're taking on the responsibility of reinvesting, building the bridges, making a difference. And we'll continue to do that.
We're well on our way to building a stronger, more prosperous, and equitable North for generations to come.
That gives you a very brief introduction to the Arctic Gateway Group. This is the organization represented by or owned by 41 First Nations groups that are owning the railway and the port and investing in this and moving it forward. And as you can see, a lot of investment coming. So we'll look at a bit more of that. Uh, but there are some other things that people are pointing out. Well, what about the environment? Beluga whales, you can actually go and paddle like these folks are uh, up at Churchill, and of course the polar bears in the wintertime. Uh, Sustainability, the question of moving oil and some concerns about what would happen if you have a problem with that, uh, as well as the question of the time frame for development. Uh, we're certainly seeing a change in the ice coverage. The ice cap is melting back all the time, and we're seeing a greater part every year. So when do we get to the point where we can actually open and keep this open year round? So in order of implementation, the Churchill has announced what is the Port of Churchill Plus, and these are some of the announcements they made recently. The federal government has announced that it would like to see Churchill become a year-round northern trade uh, hub, and this is again reiterated in the budget that they have an interest in Churchill. The province of Manitoba has stepped up with a $750,000 feasibility study to look at ice breaking and whether we can actually affordably keep ice breaking year round and or at least in the winter, I should say, and whether what size we need and how will we do that. Interest has been expressed by FedNav. It's a major Arctic shipper from Canada. Have ice strengthened ships, and they are interested in operating year round to Churchill. We've seen now this is the second season where zinc is moving out through Churchill. It was just started off as an experimental load, but it's increasing in volume. An energy corridor has been discussed in many times. We don't necessarily have any proponents at this point to point to. And of course, the Churchill group of the Hudson's Bay Railway has plans to upgrade the railway to a Class 1 rail standard. At the present time, the railway will carry 268,000 pounds on the rail cars. The standard is 280,000, so about 10% less. And of course, this uh, limitation makes the port less desirable for shipping long haul commodities. So the plan is to move that forward, and that's underway. And then finally, the idea of an all season road has been floated as well. We'll see where that goes. But what this all tells us is that there's activity going on. Churchill is changing, interest is changing, and with that, we expect to see more development. So some of the economic questions that arise is what is the demand of two-way and one-way traffic? I mentioned potash being one. Container traffic is a second possibility. how much volume could we see moving through Churchill, and would it be sufficient to generate a service that would be frequent enough for shippers to want to use it? How much port terminal investment is required and where? There is this issue of the wildlife in this area and the question of the port, and even for that matter, the town itself. This is a very well known tourist destination. Is it going to be a tourist destination and an industrial port? Or should the industrial port be located either to the left or right of the current port, and a new port development for larger ships and other commodities? Well, that's again one of those questions yet to be answered. The rail investment required, again, can that part of the railway, which has been a problem, be sustained? Or do we need to look at a new route to bypass that area? What is the order of implementation? What do we do first, and how do we get there? Uh, and finally, this notion of sustainability and ice breaking, that's a key issue. If we can't have this operating 12 months of the year, then it's going to be very difficult to attract the investment that we want to make it happen. So finally, the time frame for development. I noticed that there wasn't a direct announcement in the budget as to Churchill, but certainly now that the budget is passed, the province and the group from Churchill are certainly talking to the organization looking at major developments, and I guess the news will be coming subsequently. So with that, I would conclude my presentation and welcome questions. But before I do go, I'd like to just uh, do a little advertising for the Transport Institute at the University of Manitoba. We are hosting a conference at the end of February, the 19th and 20th, and looking at northern transportation and critical minerals infrastructure and sovereignty. And we hope perhaps some of the questions I've raised here will be answered at that time, but we'll see. With that, I will stop and turn the program back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Barry. Very, very interesting presentation. Very much a topic of the day these days. I'm You mentioned that 12 months in your mind seems pretty essential. I guess we have the St. Lawrence Seaway, which manages on a bit over 9 months. Just wondering what some of the similarities and differences might be between the two contexts.
Well, it's certainly true, and and you can, but you'll notice that there isn't any container moves on most of the Great Lakes. Given how far into the middle of the continent you could come with containers, you'd think it would be a logical feeder service. I think there is a container system moving into Cleveland, although I don't know how. I think it only runs a part of the year. But if you're going to have a container service, I think you have to operate 12 months of the year. Otherwise, what do people do in the other months when you're not operating? And that's been a problem for the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway. For shipping commodities out, grain and ore and so on, well, that does work and certainly has for many years.
And with regards to ice breaking and ice cover, I mean, this is quite different from, say, the Northwest Passage. The ice doesn't accumulate year after year. Um, so, I mean, does 12 months seem realistic to you?
Well, again, this is that study. I I don't want to get on thin ice by making too many propositions on this, but the reality is that the ice is thinning, and it is single year ice. There's no question of that. So it is easier to come through, and it's saltwater ice. The Great Lakes is much more difficult with freshwater ice than saltwater ice. But we keep the St. Lawrence open with ice breaking, so I think we could. One of the issues that's come to my attention is that loose ice and pack ice may be more of a problem. So a ship gets stuck in moving ice. So again, we don't know how this is going to work, but I think we certainly have an opportunity to try and find out.
Okay, with that, I think we'll move on to questions in the chat box. There's a lot of people that have joined since I gave, I guess, some instructions at the start, but we managed the discussion through the chat box. So if you have any questions that you'd like to be addressed, then please do type them in there, and we'll move through them sequentially. So our first one, acknowledged by Peter to be a little bit off topic, but what do you think of the potential for Moosonee as a new expanded port? Uh, I guess
I
with
know
regard to
it's
Ontario Minerals.
I know it's been discussed. The biggest problem there is the depth of the water. It is a pretty shallow bay, and so the question of how do you get bigger ships in, and also, of course, the ice movement. There's the gyre in Hudson's Bay moves counterclockwise. So the ice comes, in fact, that's how the polar bears get to James Bay. They get on at Churchill and ride the ice down to James Bay and then they get off and walk back home to Churchill. So that ice would be coming down on them. So it might be a bigger issue than at Churchill, where you could go up the west coast of Hudson's Bay and around maybe a little easier with the ice. But again, this is a topic that we need to explore. I think we should explore all the avenues. Certainly, that west coast of Hudson's Bay is more open water. We see that.
Okay, the next question from Natasha. I'd be curious to know, how does adding improvements to Port of Churchill project and Arctic Gateway to the list of nationally significant projects change things? Is there anything else that could help expedite these two projects?
Well, I think it really comes down to money and investment, and I think it's been ignored for a long time. Uh, but it is a major investment needed, and as we mentioned in the corridors, political issues and policy can change the fortunes of corridors. I think one of the reasons that Churchill's taking such attention is that Canada's looking for another alternative to trade with the U.S. and to operate more trade from the U.S. If we can develop it through Churchill, that will certainly be desirable. It's also this issue of sovereignty. I didn't mention it much, but the Churchill is the only year-round route to the Arctic in the center of the country, and we're getting more nervous about the north as the ice opens up and patrolling it and dealing with it. So to the extent that it's a strategic location, and it always has been from a military purpose, that may also encourage more investment.
Okay, the next question's from Gord, I think. I won't speculate on the acronyms that are in the question, but any thoughts on requirements to make the HBR and POC low carbon?
Yeah, well, I guess all the rail lines are looking at that. Of course, it's easier said than done for a number of reasons. We do know already that the railways and shipping is the least carbon means of transport to begin with. So, yes, you can always improve things, but I guess if you're comparing it to other modes of transport, shipping and rail are already much better.
And from John, you mentioned the population of the Prairie province is more than half of that population is in Alberta alone, and northern Alberta is far more populated than the other two provinces. Can the oil, gas, potash, uranium, etc. of northern Saskatchewan and Alberta efficiently be tapped with expansion of rail to this project, or is Alberta best to look elsewhere, such as with the Grays Bay Road and port proposal?
Well, some people have mentioned the question of permafrost, but certainly the pipeline across the land, Alaska, sorry, get that out, Alaska covers permafrost, and it's a raised pipeline, and it's been working for as long as I can remember now. So I don't think there's a technical issue as to why you couldn't put a pipeline through Churchill or to Churchill. It's the distance actually is much shorter than people think. We get confused by flat Earth maps. The north looks like it's much wider than it actually is if you look at that distance. And since it's all, pretty flat, although again you're covering some terrain that's swampy in places and river crossings and so on, but you're not going over a mountain. So in terms of moving petroleum products out through Churchill, I think there's certainly a case for it. And that issue of population, I'm thinking actually more about the container movements, because again, you have a pretty big population bringing goods in and out today, and much more manufacturing on the prairies than when Churchill was established. So the possibility of value-added products moving, and we move many other products through containers than just manufactured goods. The lentils, for example, on the grain side, and we see lumber moving in containers. So there's many other products moving in containers that we produce.
And from David, there has been talk of upgrading the weight capacity of the line from the PA to Churchill from 268,000 to 286,000 pounds. If you were the port operator, would you do this in consultation with CN?
Well, I think certainly the difficulty is that the Class 1 railways today have that higher weight limit of 286. And if you're going to ship goods, they'll be on the Class 1 railways first before they get to the handoff at the PA to go on the HBR. So if you have to underload your cars, that's an expense all the way for the product. I think this is more than just a top priority. It's certainly mentioned by the CEO of the HBR that this is something they are very focused on is upgrading that rail line to the heavier weights.
And from Ross, do you have any information on the cost feasibility for infrastructure to support container loading or non-loading via Churchill, assuming the rail line would feed an inland transloading terminal in Winnipeg? Could that potentially sway government to make that investment to allow for increased activity?
It's a good question. Again, before anybody gets too excited about the container terminal, we have to have a company that wants to do it. And of course, DP World has got about 130 container terminals around the world, and there might be some nervousness about inviting the Chinese to do this, but I don't really have that fear myself. And there are others. And of course, the issue about a container terminal is utilization. It's expensive to build these cranes in a port. So you need that 12 months of operation. So I think before anybody is going to invest in a container terminal, they're going to want to see the ice breaking there first.
Just a request from Dean, who's administrating this session with me. I guess there's a few registrations where we haven't received your contact information. So if you could reach out to her, that would be appreciated. So moving on to a question from Laura. We hear a lot about the exports, but you mentioned two-way traffic volume. What are some of the import or backhaul opportunities?
Well, certainly I've mentioned containers. That's sort of the first one I'm thinking of. But we do have imports of fertilizer that have come in through the port before. That's one possibility. Trying to think what other bulk material could come in. There has been discussion, for example, of iron ore in the St. Mary's River. I think it's in Baffin Island. That might come down through Churchill and the rail line into production in Canada or in the US. So that would be another two-way movement. Again, it's speculative whether that could be done. But, I think if we have the system available, that's when people will start to take a hard look at it and see whether it makes sense. So, but until you have the infrastructure, you can't do very much.
And from Warren, regarding icebreaking, how many icebreaker boats would we need to keep the route open year-round? Are the
Yeah.
two new icebreakers planned for the 2030 time period related to Churchill? And how can we afford them? They each cost 3 billion, just pocket change.
Yeah, well, again, I suppose this is where that study by the Manitoba government is going to give us some of those answers. Yes, nothing is cheap these days, it seems. But if you're looking at a volume of trade, how much per ton is it costing? Because yes, you have to buy these ships. I agree, they're a lot of money, but they also last quite a while. So, it's a capital cost that's spread out, and of course, operating costs. It's a pretty long distance. So again, we don't know, and this is one of the issues that we need to find out. I think it is really a key issue.
And from Don, rail track Gilliam to Churchill is on permafrost. How is a rail line going to support heavy freight in an economically feasible way now and in the future with a warming planet?
Well, that's one of my concerns as well. There has been talk of these, I don't know if I know the technical issue, but it's air siphons that essentially pull the air down into the ground and keep the ground frozen. There's siphons, I think they're called, to do that. And that has been shown to work in Alaska and other places. But if we're looking at the kind of climate change that we're seeing, and by the way, everyone, this week in Winnipeg, it's all above freezing the whole week. We've got no snow here. We're certainly seeing climate change happening here, so I'm a believer in climate change. And you're right. If we get enough climate change, I can't see how that peat bog will survive. Uh, and this is why, we need to look at the possibility of a route around that area. It's only from Gillam North, about 250 kilometers or so, that would be have to be replaced. And if it's on the rock, then the permafrost problem goes away. Um, I guess people might say, oh, it costs a lot of money to do that. True, it does, but it would be one of those once in a lifetime investments and forever investments. I mean, once you have a rail line there on the rocks, I don't think there'd be any problem in the future. And we certainly have spent a lot of money on building pipelines and other things across the country. So, again, I don't see it as being unreasonable.
Okay, there's something from Chris, which I think is mostly a comment, which I'd invite you to review. But I guess at the bottom, it's talking about insurance-related issues. So
Yeah.
maybe we could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, the insurance problem has been a limitation on the season of Churchill. Even though the water is open now a longer period, the ships are only able to get insurance for, I'm not sure if it's 4 months or 5 months or what that time is, but it's less than the period of navigation that's possible. And of course, the insurance companies have always been on the basis of, well, if we had one accident, how many years would we have to go before we'd even get our money back on that? So they've been very reluctant to provide insurance outside the time when they don't have any risk. And insurance companies operate that way. I think in general they don't want to take risks. That's how they make their money. But nonetheless, this is something that if we had ice breaking and we have enough traffic, and it's insurance is really a function of what's the probability. And over time, if you can prove that you have low risk, and if you have enough traffic paying insurance to cover the potential of losses, then insurance should be available. But it is a problem today.
Okay, a question from Terry. Do you have any comments regarding the ongoing annual maintenance costs for the upgraded transportation infrastructure and port facilities? And how will these costs be impacted by climate change and lower sea levels from isostatic rebounding?
Yeah, the interesting question. Of course, at the same time, we've also got global warming causing the oceans to rise. So I guess it's a question of who's get there first. Do the oceans rise faster than the rebound? But obviously, if people are planning the facilities, they better keep that in mind. What would be the future depth of the water and what would it look like? But it is, one of those, again, issues that we have to look at. Climate change has many dimensions to it, and that would certainly be one.
And the next question from Michael, I guess, is questioning Churchill as a naval and coast guard base, I guess, in terms of those functions.
Well, again, it's handy in the sense that you can resupply it pretty quickly. Again, there's a naval base that's been established up at Navisivic on the north end of Baffin Island. But if you think about it, trying to get supplies to that location, even petroleum for the ships and supplies to the crews, it must be a pretty expensive issue because you don't have year-round access. Whereas if you're operating out of Churchill, you'd certainly have lower costs for your supplies and support. There is also, of course, at Churchill, a very large air base or airstrip left over from previous times. It's very well connected that way, so moving people in and out, as well as support for the ships and if parts needed, again, being able to bring them in by rail any day that you choose. I think there's a lot to be said for it. The downside, of course, is it's a long way south. A lot of the area that we need to patrol and keep an eye on is quite a ways north of Hudson's Bay. So again, this is a military issue, which I'm not really very competent to talk about, except in a general way.
And it seems you're receiving thanks from Enrique in Lima, Peru.
Oh,
So it seems we have a global reach. I guess I should ask how well is the Port of Churchill able to connect to Peru?
well, Peru is very interesting. There's a huge port that's been developed at Chanche, about 80 kilometers north of Lima. The Chinese have invested a huge amount of money in that port for containers, and it's becoming a hub for container traffic. So I could certainly see connections between Peru and North Hudson's Bay operating for products like potash coming out. Now, again, it can also go out through Vancouver on the west coast. If it leaves out of Hudson's Bay, it's going to have to go through the Panama Canal. So, I'm not sure it's the best route to Lima or to Peru, I should say, but certainly it's something that we see worldwide. New trade routes are developing.
Next question from Alistair, just as to whether there's an estimated cost to upgrade the rail line.
Yeah, that I don't know if anybody has exactly what that number is. I think it really depends on what you plan to do. There is an announcement. I remember a number of 51 million was announced to do the ongoing repairs right now and upgrades, and more has been invested, as you can see in a little video, railway ties and bridges and so on. So they've made a lot of improvements already. That key part is the link from Gillam up to Churchill. And that part, you can almost pick a number. We take an average, and I'll just number from the air of 10 million a mile for a rail line. That would be what, 250 kilometers, or sorry, 10 million a kilometer, I should say. 250 kilometers, that'd be $2.5 billion. It's not cheap. Nobody should confuse us with that. But again, it's a forever investment. And we're building a country, and the country goes on long after we're gone. So maybe it is a good idea.
From John, the rail bed issue for the HBR has been a constant concern for a number of previous operators. Permafrost thawing is expanding with climate change and further exacerbates rehabilitation potential. Are there new rail bed opportunities to minimize operating risk due to this thawing?
Well, again, there's no permafrost problem until you get to Gillam. It's only from Gillam to Churchill that you had the permafrost problem across the peat bog. And I would point out that, the railway got built there out of sort of a need because they were going to Port Nelson, and then they found out that that port was silting in and wouldn't be possible to use. And so to salvage the situation, they made a very hard left turn at Gillam and went straight north to Churchill over what was, I guess, a flat area and more easy to build on, which was the permafrost. But had they been from the start thinking about doing it, I don't think they would have chosen that route. Because if they had gone 50 or 100 kilometers further to the west, they'd have been out of that area.
All right, tons of questions. We may not get through them all, but we'll certainly do our best. Hopefully, Barry's got the energy to answer them all. We hear a fair bit about investment in the HBR and in Churchill, but has anything been considered about infrastructure investment in the PA or Thompson, where the railway connects to CN or the highway trucking network?
Yeah, I think the HBR has been investing in the whole line, and in fact, they mentioned recently there was a storm, and they had to clear a whole bunch of trees that had gone fall over, and they're maintaining the whole line. They're not only looking at any part of it, or piece of it. And the part into Thompson obviously is useful and important for the service there. Typically, that's where a lot of the goods today tend to be trucked to Thompson and then put on the railway to move into Churchill, as opposed to going the rail all distance. And that's really, I think, a matter of speed and convenience. So the route through Thompson is important. The other, rail line that was built up the uh, sort of the west side of Manitoba to Lynn Lake. Again, that was built for the mines that were there. It's been disused now, but the roadbed is there, and if there was a desire, again, it could be put back into place. But the APA and other parts, again, I think the investment's on the whole system, not just any one particular spot.
From John, you mentioned a number of potential commodities that could drive volumes through the Port of Churchill. Any potential partnerships with producers, for example, coal from Elk Valley in BC, or oil and LNG from Alberta, or agricultural products from the prairies, such as roquette peas.
Yeah, again, interesting comment. I don't know of any of these uh, producers or shippers who have been in contact. I'm sure they've been discussing this with the railway themselves. The agricultural commodities, they're pretty stiff competition through Thunder Bay and Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and the grain companies have their own terminals. They don't really want to see product going through a terminal they don't own. That's one of the reasons why we don't see much grain going through that. It was kind of forced that way through Churchill when the Canadian Wheat Board existed. But the route still exists, and there are products that could move. Again, it's back to the willingness of those shippers. I think the real point is that we no longer have to depend on agriculture to sustain the port. I think there are enough other commodities and interests that could do that. And certainly, if it makes sense for agriculture, products will move. And peas may be a good example of that. Things have moved in the past.
Uh, from uh, from John, a different John this time. What do you think a vigorous corridor to and through Churchill, fed by a rail line not owned by the two Class 1s, could do for overcoming the problems that grain shippers find objectionable?
Well, that now we go back about 125 years to the farm movement at that time, which did not like the idea of the railway monopoly. In that time, there was only one railway, the CPR, and they were the ones who pushed to get the railway there in the first place. So I suppose to some degree that feeling has never left the prairies. That the farmers feel captive to the railways and not necessarily happy with their performance all the time. That being said, there is an area in northern Saskatchewan which is actually, you could say, tributary to Churchill. It's the least cost route would be going through Churchill. So there is an area that would be there. I don't necessarily see a lot of grain being deviated from the southern part of the prairies because, again, we've got very well established systems with unit trains and loop tracks. And, again, the time to get to the port, because the rail has not been in good condition, the speeds are low. So the actual turnaround time or the cycle time for a train to get loaded to Churchill and get back is much greater than going to the other ports, and that has been a great disadvantage as well.
So there's a comment from Chris about Project Cargo being a good inbound option. Also, there's a question from Barry about outbound lumber. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think outbound lumber is interesting. I saw the other day in a news article that the Canadian forest industry was trying hard to resuscitate or expand, maybe you should say, markets in Europe and in particular England for lumber. Again, try to substitute that shipments to the US, which have been affected by tariffs for some time. A logical way for that to go would be out through Churchill. And as I pointed out, a lot of lumber these days is moving in containers. They found it, a better method of moving lumber than a break bulk system. which used to be the dominant way of moving lumber. So yeah, I think lumber has an interesting possibility, and certainly a lot of production in Alberta, especially of plywood and so on, which could go. Uh, with the other commodities, well, again, it depends.
Okay, from Deb. Has anyone considered auxiliary community support services to the community, including housing, health care, emergency disaster, and rescue service for potential shipping incidents?
Well, that's a good question. And since we don't know what those would be, it's hard to answer that. Obviously, this is something that any development that goes on is going to have to be prepared for the worst and to be able to deal with any kinds of spills. And the people who are there also are going to have to be in agreement. Now, the mere fact that we have an operation that's First Nation owned and represented very widely does help because obviously they're the ones who are able to communicate with the other people who may not be owners, about their interests. And there is a lot of sensitivity to that, there's no question. But it does raise another point, which is, the northern part of the province has got a lot lower incomes than the south. And one of the things that this extra traffic through Churchill will do is it'll bring more prosperity to the north. And so people will be able to afford more and live a better life. And I think that's something that's very much in desire. And Churchill itself, the community is really built to have many more people than live there today. So again, it's not like we have to invest in a lot of extra infrastructure to expand that population, but we need jobs, and this is what that will bring.
From Al, could future Manitoba hydro water control structures in the lower Nelson River and in controlling silting in the Port Nelson area? If so, and considering all the potential commodity dedicated port infrastructure, is there room for both Churchill and Port Nelson?
Well, this is an interesting question indeed, because there's a group called Nistanin, which is also has a First Nations component to it. And they've been working very hard to promote the idea of establishing a port at Churchill, or sorry, Port Nelson. And their idea is to move it a little further out from where the original site was, to be on the coast more, to avoid some of those problems. But again, as pointed out, the dams have certainly changed the water flow from what it was 100 years ago, and so maybe that problem that we used to have from the river isn't as great. There's still the problem of the silt coming in from the bay, which is another issue. The issue for me that's more a question mark is, does the government want to invest in the resources necessary to establish another new community, given they already have one, which is somewhat underpopulated? And that would, I think, be maybe the resistance on the government side. Now, that being said, people can fly in and out, and you can operate, very highly automated ports with not that many people. So maybe that's not the issue that I think it is. But I would certainly believe that would be one that would come up.
Believe it or not, we're still admitting people at 12:58 p.m. Um,
Well, I hope you let everybody know that the presentation was recorded, so
yes,
they will
yes,
be able to get that afterwards.
yeah. The next question is, I assume the old I-29 Gulf to Bay north-south trade corridor has been scrapped.
Well, it's one of those topics that waxes and wanes with politicians and trade flows. I think we're referring to the Mid-Continent Corridor, the idea of trade all the way from, uh, I guess, Churchill, if you wish, to Mexico City. And clearly there's a new impetus for that in a way because of the merger of the Canadian Pacific with the Kansas City Southern, or the new CPKC rail line, which has a single route all the way from certainly Winnipeg to Mexico City. And you can do that on a single line of operations, one billing, and the railway can have complete control of the equipment. That actually is going to make a difference, I believe. And, there's still adjusting to that change. I know it takes time to digest these sorts of things in a merger, but I believe there's going to be a lot more trade moving in, and that will give more encouragement to that impetus for the North-South movement. Whether Churchill can fit into that very easily, I'm not so sure. In the rail line, if you look at the hinterland of Churchill, it's actually more Saskatchewan and Alberta than it is Manitoba. You know, you have to circle back around on the west side of the province to get to Winnipeg, and Winnipeg has many other options in terms of transport to the south and the east. So I think it's really Alberta and Saskatchewan are the biggest beneficiaries of that port development.
Okay, we've reached 1 o'clock, but we've still got 100 attendees. So I'm thinking that if Barry is willing, we should go on for a few minutes
Sure, I'm
to
happy
answer a
to.
few more questions. Clearly, the topics generate a lot of interest. Clearly, if you have to leave the session, then please go ahead. But the rest of us will continue for a few minutes. So a couple of questions from Natasha. Given limited resources, what are the other top of mind trade and transportation projects we should be aware of? And secondly, can you maybe speak a little bit about the central theme of your conference in February and target audience?
Yes, no, thank you. Well, one of those, of course, is the Ontario project, the Ring of Fire, that which I think Ontario government is now committed to making a connection to the Ring of Fire area. That's certainly a critical development, which will open up a huge resource base for development of the country. There is a discussion of more roads in Northwest Territories to open up again mining areas. There's some difficulties there I see between the where they would like to put the corridor from Yellowknife up on the I guess it on the east side of Great Bear Lake up to the Arctic. It goes through the calving grounds of the caribou, and I think there may be some environmental issues that we'll run into on that one. But that's certainly another one that has sparked a lot of interest in the north. And of course, there's always a demand for roads. We have a lot of isolated communities that are waiting and been waiting a long time to get a road to them. I'm not sure it's the best way of doing it. Of course, people who are listening to this who know me would know that I have a strong interest in using cargo airships as a means of serving the North, and that would be less expensive and less intrusive, especially as we have an uncertain future with climate change and melting permafrost. Even existing road networks have been problematic because the permafrost melts underneath and makes it like an accordion that you can't drive on. So there is some issues ahead of us as climate change persists.
Next question from Warren. A lot of discussion on how Churchill might provide lower cost transportation routes. Has there been any study on how much transportation costs for the existing corridors could be reduced with the same capital investment that would be necessary to bring Churchill online? Several $100 million of federal and provincial investment in the Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Kitimat, and St. Lawrence corridors could also go a long way.
Well, it's maybe true, but it's like the old issue of a marginal investment. We've already seen a huge amount of investment in Vancouver and Rupert and other places. Montreal as well is having a big new container terminal being built as one of those priority areas. So there's already a lot of investment being has been made. So, adding to that, the bang for your buck gets less as you go further and further up the list of projects to do. Churchill, given that we have so little there already, the possibility of a bigger payoff, I think, is much greater from a cost benefit perspective. Uh, that being said, no, we're not going to ignore other routes by no means. I think we need to keep up the investment in all the routes. Vancouver, folks would tell you there's a certain bridge, the rail bridge over I guess it's the North Shore, which is a question mark. It's getting old, and there's a lot of traffic that moves there, and And there's a lot of shippers on that side, and it's certainly a key priority for investment too.
There's a comment from Enrique in Peru, which I invite you to review. But a question from Don: what about Port Nelson being promoted by Fox Lake Cree Nation to avoid the permafrost issue or permafrost route? Sorry.
Well, that's its strength, is that it would be a route, and that was why it was chosen in the first place, because it did have that advantage. I believe the Fox Lake group is actually part of the Arctic Gateway group as well. They're one of the 41 group that own the system, so I guess they have a foot in both camps. But that area, Port Nelson, is more in their area. Again, we won't know. I mean, it comes back to if the private sector is interested in investing in that and comes up with a plan, uh, you know, the government will likely take a hard look at it. But I think at the present time, there's more impetus to build something out at the Churchill area.
From Brad, shipper commitments often provide the base load new routes. Would you please address this regarding this project?
Well, yeah, so the difficulty is I've got an empty basket to show you because I don't have any shipper commitments at this point, and I suppose it's a question of who goes first. You until the infrastructure is there and shippers can be confident that it makes sense, why would they invest in it or pay a lot of attention to it? They have routes now, and while it could be better and could be more profitable for them to use, until there's a lower risk, which is what the government has to take on, I don't think they're going to come forward and be very, vocal about what they want to do.
Okay, a question from Terry. Data shows Arctic oceans are experiencing lower water levels, not increasing, compounded by seafloor lifting due to isostatic rebounding. What does this mean for ongoing maintenance costs?
Well, again, the pace of that rebound is not, meters per year. It's inches. And obviously, navigation inches do matter. You do have to have a certain draft to operate. Again, this is not an area where I'm an expert in and can really comment more than generally to say that this is part of the issue that has to be studied. And obviously, if you're going to accommodate that within your infrastructure, make sure that you do have an eye on that.
From Trevor, we are discussing aggregate matters of the infrastructure, but the economics is dependent on the value of a route in the supply chains of companies. When do their interests come into the evaluation and by whom?
Well, again, as I'd say, the government has to create the conditions under which they are interested. And the signal going out right now is that the government is committed to do something. And so that will help give some encouragement to the shippers to take a look at this. Does it make sense for them? And obviously, they will have to build along with the government. It's not a case of waiting until everything's in place and then try to make a decision. I'm sure there are some shippers who are looking at it. Obviously, the potash folks, they have a system already in place. Campotex has facilities and they operate a fair amount of the material. So they don't necessarily want to have less utilization on their current volumes than they have. But as volumes increase or potential increases, again, they'd be looking at do they expand where they are or do they add more capacity, say, at Churchill? So these are questions of business and where's the business case is always the question for any kind of development.
A question from Bill. We might have touched on this a little bit, but if the government was making a purely economic decision to improve our trade corridors and gateways, do you think it would prioritize investment in the St. Lawrence over Hudson's Bay and Churchill?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, you have to also remember that uh, acres don't vote, people vote. And there's a lot of people living in the Toronto Quebec City corridor, and there's a lot of interest there already that are probably looking at ways that they could improve their corridor and looking for support for government to do that. The government is supporting that new terminal in some fashion. I'm not really sure if it's just approvals or whether they're actually investing at Montreal, but they are certainly supporting that development. And, to some degree, because that's where most people live and most of our industry is, it's a logical route and we have to maintain that. But it already is a pretty well functioning route, so I'm not sure what improvements are required.
Question from Terry. Does anyone have a reliable cost-benefit analysis accounting for anticipated benefits and unpredictable and unknown expenditures, including direct and indirect affected audiences?
I would say probably not. It's still pretty early. We're at the point where we've been, uh, in some ways, it's been felt need. The question is, do you let the rail line crumble and have Churchill isolated, or do you fix the railway up so it can still be used? So it was really a matter of felt need to invest in the improvements so far. I think at this point is where we're starting to see more conscious questions of, what makes sense and where does it make sense? And I have questions of my own in that regard as to, do you expand the port where it is, or do you establish some port that's adjacent to that for larger ships to operate? And this is one of those cost benefit analysis that will absolutely be needed.
From Chris, as the port expands, there would be need for expansion of housing and various services in order to run the port. Have you heard much on this topic?
No, I've been to Churchill, and there's certainly lots of land, so it's not like you can't expand. But again, a lot of it's rock that you're on. The surface doesn't have a lot of topsoil, so putting in services, I'm sure, can be a challenge, as it is in just anywhere in the north. But there are certainly people living there now, and they're operating and functioning. So it's not that it can't be done. It's a matter of, investment and indeed in the short run, there's probably enough capacity currently at Churchill for a certain amount of expansion. But at some point in time, again, how big a place could it be? We really don't know how big, and also what we see happening in other ports, like the one in Peru. Very highly mechanized operation. You don't need as many people to run the port as used to be the case. So how many people are actually needed to live there year round is an interesting question.
There's a quick question from Megan about the February event, so I think we can take it. It's just whether it's in person or hybrid.
We're looking at having it in person. We haven't actually decided whether to have a hybrid version or not. Uh, there is a discussion, and we're actually ongoing a discussion as do we make it available online, because a lot of the people who would be most affected of northern transportation don't have the way to get to Manitoba, to Winnipeg to attend in person, and the costs are pretty prohibitive flying down from the north. So we have been looking closely at the idea of making it a hybrid conference. Um, Again, I love this webinar because here I am sitting at my luxury in my home and able to talk with you today, which is really an advantage. But there's some benefits of in-person conferences where you actually get to meet people, and there's a certain energy in the room and discussion that you don't get with a webinar like this. So I think at the present time we're looking at perhaps a hybrid. We haven't actually decided.
I guess we'll say last question. We made it to about 1:15. It's from Chris. A rail line through northern Manitoba across to the Ring of Fire may be interesting since there are a number of potential mines in northern Manitoba on the way. Any thoughts?
Well, that area goes through the Hudson's Bay lowlands, which is the same peat bog kind of soils that we see further north. I don't know how far that extends, but that is certainly a difficult terrain to cover. and it would be a lot longer distance than going north from basically Thunder Bay as your connection. So I would think as a shipper, I would probably be looking closer at moving things through Thunder Bay or even on the rail to Sudbury and out. Depends again on where the processing is going to be. One of the things that we've been missing, I think, in Canada is we haven't been investing very much in value adding our products. We've been shipping a lot of products out, and even to the extent that we smelt some of our metals, we just export raw metals. I think part of what has to change in Canada is a bit more moving up the value chain.
All right. So with that, I think we'll bring things to a close. It was it was quite labor intensive just to read the questions, so I can't imagine what it was like answering them. But it was a tremendous discussion. A lot of depth and detail was covered, and that goes for the main presentation as well. So thank you very much, Barry, for everything. It was greatly appreciated. Before we sign off, I just wanted to mention again the December presentation is going to feature Kara Kokelman from the University of Texas. So I hope that many or most of you will be able to join us in December. So thank you very much to everybody.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Thank
Bye
you,
for
Barry.
now.